Back 100 years ago, especially around Woodrow Wilson, what happened in this country is we took freedom and we chopped it into pieces. When one gets in bed with government, one must expect the diseases it spreads. To me, to be a conservative means to conserve the good parts of America and to conserve our Constitution. A system of capitalism presumes sound money, not fiat money manipulated by a central bank. Capitalism cherishes voluntary contracts and interest rates that are determined by savings, not credit creation by a central bank. Capitalism should not be condemned, since we haven't had capitalism. Real patriotism is a willingness to challenge the government when it's wrong. If you like small government, you need to work hard at having a strong national defense that is not so militant. Personal liberty is the purpose of government, to protect liberty, not to run your personal life, not to run the economy, and not to pretend that we can tell the world how they ought to live. Well, I don't think we should go to the moon. I think we maybe should send some politicians up there. The most important element of a free society, where individual rights are held in the highest esteem, is the rejection of the initiation of violence. I am absolutely opposed to a national ID card. This is a total contradiction of what a free society is all about. The purpose of government is to protect the secrecy and the privacy of all individuals, not the secrecy of government. We don't need a national ID card. When the federal government spends more each year than it collects in tax revenues, it has three choices: it can raise taxes, print money, or borrow money. While these actions may benefit politicians, all three options are bad for average Americans. I am just absolutely convinced that the best formula for giving us peace and preserving the American way of life is freedom, limited government, and minding our own business overseas. Legitimate use of violence can only be that which is required in self-defense. How did we win the election in the year 2000? We talked about a humble foreign policy, no nation building, don't police the world. That's conservative, it's Republican, it's pro-American, it follows the Founding Fathers. And, besides, it follows the Constitution. I think a submarine is a very worthwhile weapon. I believe we can defend ourselves with submarines and all our troops back at home. This whole idea that we have to be in 130 countries and 900 bases is an old-fashioned idea. Setting a good example is a far better way to spread ideals than through force of arms. All initiation of force is a violation of someone else's rights, whether initiated by an individual or the state, for the benefit of an individual or group of individuals, even if it's supposed to be for the benefit of another individual or group of individuals. Maybe we ought to consider a golden rule in foreign policy: don't do to other nations what we don't want happening to us. We endlessly bomb these countries and then we wonder why they get upset with us. The moral and constitutional obligations of our representatives in Washington are to protect our liberty, not coddle the world, precipitating no-win wars, while bringing bankruptcy and economic turmoil to our people. I have never met anyone who did not support our troops. Sometimes, however, we hear accusations that someone or some group does not support the men and women serving in our armed forces. But this is pure demagoguery, and it is intellectually dishonest. I like Mitt Romney as a person. I think he's a dignified person. But I have no common ground on economics. He doesn't worry about the Federal Reserve. He doesn't worry about foreign policy. He doesn't talk about civil liberties, so I would have a hard time to expect him to ever invite me to campaign with him. Aggression and forced redistribution of wealth has nothing to do with the teachings of the world's great religions. You don't have freedom because you are a hyphenated American, you have freedom because you are an individual, and that should be protected. Clichés about supporting the troops are designed to distract from failed policies, policies promoted by powerful special interests that benefit from war. Anything to steer the discussion away from the real reasons the war in Iraq will not end anytime soon. There is only one kind of freedom, and that's individual liberty. Our lives come from our Creator and our liberty comes from our Creator. It has nothing to do with government granting it. I will always vote what I have promised, and always vote the Constitution, as well as I will not vote for one single penny that isn't paid for, because debt is the monster. Debt is what's going to eat us up, and that is why our economy is on the brink. Believe me, the next step is a currency crisis because there will be a rejection of the dollar. The rejection of the dollar is a big, big event, and then your personal liberties are going to be severely threatened. There is nothing wrong with describing conservatism as protecting the Constitution, protecting all things that limit government. Government is the enemy of liberty. Government should be very restrained. You don't quit because you happen to be behind. You want to see how you do. And who knows? Maybe somebody will stumble. The obligations of our representatives in Washington are to protect our liberty, not coddle the world, precipitating no-win wars, while bringing bankruptcy and economic turmoil to our people. Everyone assumes America must play the leading role in crafting some settlement or compromise between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But Jefferson, Madison, and Washington explicitly warned against involving ourselves in foreign conflicts. Prices are going up. Unemployment continues to go up. And we have not had the necessary correction for the financial bubble created by our Federal Reserve System. Just think of what Woodrow Wilson stood for. He stood for world government. He wanted an early United Nations, League of Nations. But it was the conservatives, Republicans, that stood up against him. In time it will become clear to everyone that support for the policies of preemptive war and interventionist nation-building will have much greater significance than the removal of Saddam Hussein itself. Another term for preventive war is aggressive war, starting wars because someday somebody might do something to us. That is not part of the American tradition. I would like to restore your right to drink raw milk anytime you like. You want to get rid of drug crime in this country? Fine, let's just get rid of all the drug laws. Of course, I've already taken a very modest position on the monetary system. I do take the position that we should just end the Fed. Justifying conscription to promote the cause of liberty is one of the most bizarre notions ever conceived by man. Forced servitude, with the risk of death and serious injury as a price to live free, makes no sense. Have you noticed the debt is exploding? And it's not all because of Medicare. War is never economically beneficial except for those in position to profit from war expenditures. Having federal officials, whether judges, bureaucrats, or congressmen, impose a new definition of marriage on the people is an act of social engineering profoundly hostile to liberty. Deficits mean future tax increases, pure and simple. Deficit spending should be viewed as a tax on future generations, and politicians who create deficits should be exposed as tax hikers. Why is it claimed that if people won't or can't take care of their own needs, that people in government can do it for them? I'd like to think of myself as the flavor of the decade. When things go badly, individuals look for scapegoats. I just do not believe that barbed wire fences or guns on our border will solve any of our problems. Believe me, the intellectual revolution is going on, and that has to come first before you see the political changes. That's where I'm very optimistic. I had the privilege of practicing medicine in the early 60s, before we had any government. It worked rather well, and there was nobody on the street suffering with no medical care. Throughout the 20th century, the Republican Party benefited from a non-interventionist foreign policy. Think of how Eisenhower came in to stop the Korean War. Think of how Nixon was elected to stop the mess in Vietnam. During the last campaign I knew what was happening. You know, they mocked me for my foreign policy and they laughed at my monetary policy. No more. No more. As recent as the year 2000 we won elections by saying we shouldn't be the policemen of the world, and that we should not be nation building. And it's time we got those values back into this country. There's nothing wrong with being a conservative and coming up with a conservative belief in foreign policy where we have a strong national defense and we don't go to war so carelessly. What is not conservative about saying, don't go to war unless we go to war properly with a full declaration of war and no other way. I would think they're going to study it a little more closely. It appears that the threshold has been reached where consumers are feeling the pinch of higher gas prices and are beginning to reduce their restaurant spending. We are also seeing softness in restaurant same-store sales, which we track monthly, further validating a reduction in consumer spending. It is good to get the brand out there because it is a way to get trial and differentiate yourself from the competition. I think they are a treat. There are enough consumers who are willing to treat themselves frequently or once in a while. Without question, we're seeing a slowdown. They'll have one glass of wine instead of two, or they're skipping the appetizers. We are, of course, proud of the many accomplishments we have achieved over the past 40 years. That said, I am even more excited about our plans for the future. As chains go, it's doing very well, and investors are reacting to it. You run the risk of customers trading down, which drives down check averages and hurts profits. Think of what happened after 9/11, the minute before there was any assessment. There was glee in the administration because now we can invade Iraq, and so the war drums beat. The younger generation isn't gravitating toward that. They've grown up with many more options. They're more interested in experimenting and in healthy, natural foods. It's not well situated in the loop. It doesn't have a vibrant evening audience to draw from. They basically have developed almost a cult-like following. I think it's partly as a result of their emphasis on higher quality ingredients. They broke the mold when they decided to do music. If bookstores have coffee, then why can't a coffee store sell books and movies? They've got to make a decision. They've got to ramp it up and start opening at a faster pace, sell it back to the original owners or make a public offering. I think all things are being considered. If you really want to get beyond just tourist locations, where you aren't dependent on regular customers, then you have to go back to the basics. Very definitely play down the gimmicks, play down the museum aspects of what you are doing. Make it a different enough restaurant that there's some reason to try it, and if everything else is good, customers will come back. The greatest threat facing America today is the disastrous fiscal policies of our own government, marked by shameless deficit spending and Federal Reserve currency devaluation. It is this 1-2 punch, Congress spending more than it can tax or borrow, and the Fed printing money to make up the difference, that threatens to impoverish us by further destroying the value of our dollars. Remember, politicians get votes by promising everything to everyone, always at the expense of some other invisible taxpayers. There was a time when a willingness to criticize one's own government when it was wrong was the very definition of patriotism. Libertarians are incapable of being a racist, because racism is a collectivist idea. I have my shortcomings. But the message, it has no shortcomings. The message of liberty is what America is all about. Because gold is honest money, it is disliked by dishonest men. I want to be president mainly for what I don't want to do. I don't want to run your life, I don't want to run the economy, and I don't want to police the world. The freer the market is and the more respect you have for private property, the better the environment is protected. Even if you don't like guns and don't want to own them, you benefit from those who do. Let us give up our longing for welfare, our love of war, and our desire to see the government control and shape our fellow citizens. We must come to imagine liberty again, and believe that it can be a reality. We must recapture what it means to be free. While President Obama was starting and expanding unconstitutional wars overseas, Bradley Manning, whose actions have caused exactly 0 deaths, was shining light on the truth behind these wars. They ask me if I'm going to quit. I thought we were just getting started. We have a revolution to fight, a country to change. I'm an imperfect messenger, but the message is perfect. Americans are tired of the games and the lies of today's media. They want the truth. Imagine this. No censors, no barricades, no statists. We will be able to engage viewers directly on subjects that matter most to them, from finances to civil liberties to foreign policy. Secession is a deeply American principle. This country was born through secession. If somebody's in prison for nonviolence, drug usage, and never committed a hard crime, they should be pardoned and let out. For those who have asked, I freely confess that Jesus Christ is my personal Savior, and that I seek His guidance in all that I do. The law cannot make a wicked person virtuous. God's grace alone can accomplish such a thing. What you are inferring is, if we were to legalize heroin tomorrow, everybody would use heroin. How many people here would start using heroin? I bet nobody would. Oh yeah, I need the government to take care of me. I don't want to use heroin, so I need these laws. Our federal government, which was intended to operate as a very limited constitutional republic, has instead become a virtually socialist leviathan that redistributes trillions of dollars. We can hardly be surprised when countless special interests fight for the money. The only true solution to the campaign money problem is a return to a proper constitutional government that does not control the economy. Big government and big campaign money go hand in hand. The reality is that our military presence on foreign soil is as offensive to the people that live there as armed Chinese troops would be if they were stationed in Texas. We would not stand for it here, but we have had a globe-straddling empire and a very intrusive foreign policy for decades that incites a lot of hatred and resentment toward us. To condemn free market capitalism because of anything going on today makes no sense. There is no evidence that capitalism exists today. We are deeply involved in an interventionist planned economy that allows major benefits to accrue to the politically connected of both political parties. One may condemn the fraud in the current system, but it must be called by its proper names: Keynesian inflationism, interventionism, and corporatism. Ignorance, as well as disapproval for the natural restraints placed on market excesses that capitalism and sound markets impose, cause our present leaders to reject capitalism and blame it for all the problems we face. If this fallacy is not corrected and capitalism is even further undermined, the prosperity that the free market generates will be destroyed. The Founding Fathers realized that the power to tax is the power to destroy, which is why they did not give the federal government the power to impose an income tax. Needless to say, the founders would be horrified to know that Americans today give more than a third of their income to the federal government. I am absolutely convinced, you never have to give up any of your freedoms in order to be secure. Intervention in Syria is not an option. President Obama has already helped foment this civil war and supported the al-Qaeda jihadists. This is an explosive region, and more U.S. intervention means more people will die. We should be choosing peace, not a new conflict. More so than anyone else, my supporters know that America cannot afford another unlawful, immoral war in the Middle East. Stand with me and tell President Obama to stay out of Syria. The last line of defense in support of freedom and the Constitution consists of the people themselves. If the people want to be free, if they want to lift themselves out from underneath a state apparatus that threatens their liberties, squanders their resources on needless wars, destroys the value of the dollar, and spews forth endless propaganda about how indispensable it is and how lost we would all be without it, there is no force that can stop them. Abortion on demand is the ultimate state tyranny. The state simply declares that certain classes of human beings are not persons, and therefore not entitled to the protection of the law. The state protects the right of some people to kill others, just as the courts protected the property rights of slave masters in their slaves. Moreover, by this method the state achieves a goal common to all totalitarian regimes. It sets us against each other, so that our energies are spent in the struggle between state-created classes, rather than in freeing all individuals from the state. White Castle has a unique position in the Midwest. It is a cult brand that has developed a strong, loyal following. American voters should understand that Congress will always find a way to spend every last dollar sent to Washington. Remember, politicians get votes by promising everything to everyone, always at the expense of some other invisible taxpayers. The federal government cannot maintain a budget surplus any more than an alcoholic can leave a fresh bottle of whiskey untouched in the cupboard. You don't have a right to a house, you don't have a right to a job, you don't have a right to medical care. Income taxes are responsible for the transformation of the federal government from one of limited powers into a vast leviathan whose tentacles reach into almost every aspect of American life. I have some help on tweeting. The Fourth Amendment is clear: we should be secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects, and all warrants must have probable cause. Today the government operates largely in secret, while seeking to know everything about our private lives, without probable cause and without a warrant. I don't know how to run your life. I don't know how to run your life. I don't have the authority to run your life. And the Constitution doesn't permit me to run your life. We have a greater responsibility to act than those who live in ignorance. Once you become knowledgeable, you have an obligation to do something about it. Reject the phony patient's Bill of Rights. We don't have to continue down the path of socialized medical care, especially in America where free markets have provided so much for so many. Once again, President Clinton is using American troops to deflect attention from his record of lies, distortions, obstructions of justice, and abuse of power. No one talks about the real ethics disaster in Washington. It's that many members of Congress will listen to any argument against a bill except for two: that it's not moral or that it's not constitutional. If I were in Congress in 1996, I would have voted for the Defense of Marriage Act, which used Congress's constitutional authority to define what official state documents other states have to recognize under the full faith and credit clause, to ensure that no state would be forced to recognize a same-sex marriage license issued in another state. If you're really serious about protecting people's incomes, you've got to consider how you're going to protect the dollar. If you don't have the dollar maintaining its value, no matter where you put the money, you're not going to have any value. We're bankrupting our country, and we have an empire that we're trying to defend which costs us $1 trillion a year. And the standard of living is going down today. It's going down, and the middle class is hurting because of the monetary policy. When you destroy a currency, the middle class gets wiped out. Welfarism and excessive spending and deficits and socialism divide us, because everybody has to go to Washington. Those who have the biggest clout, who are the best lobbyists, those who go and they grab. And whether it's the medical-industrial complex, or the banking industry, or the military-industrial complex, that's who ends up controlling our government. As bank customers, we tend to believe that we can have both perfect security for our money, drawing on it whenever we want and never expecting it not to be there, while still earning a regular rate of return. In a true free market, however, there tends to be a trade-off. You can enjoy a money warehouse or you can hope for a return on your investment. You can't usually have both. The Fed, however, by backing up this fractional reserve system with a promise of endless bailouts and money creation, attempts to keep the illusion going. This much is true: you have been lied to. The Federal Reserve System is nothing more than legalized counterfeit. We'd love it if we could all just come home and not worry about the rest of the world. But the problem is, they attacked us on 9/11. We were here, they attacked us. The concept of equal pay for equal work is not only an impossible task, it can only be accomplished with the total rejection of the idea of the voluntary contract. The idea that a businessman must hire anyone and is prevented from firing anyone for any reason he chooses, and in the name of rights, is a clear indication that the basic concept of a free society has been lost. History has shown that the masses have been quite receptive to the promises of authoritarians which are rarely if ever fulfilled. The notion of a rigid separation between church and state has no basis in either the text of the Constitution or the writings of our founding fathers. On the contrary, our founders' political views were strongly informed by their religious beliefs. Without question, the true goal of some in Congress is to create a system of socialized medicine. It's politically expedient to slap a patient's rights label on legislation that simply leads us closer to a complete government takeover of medicine. It is dissent from government policies which defines the true patriot. It is incumbent on a great nation to remain confident, if it wishes to remain free. We need not be ignorant to real threats to our safety, against which we must remain vigilant. We need only to banish to the ash heap of history the notion that we ought to be ruled by our fears and those who use them to enhance their own power. It is not democracy to send in billions of dollars to push regime change overseas. It isn't democracy to send in the NGOs to rewrite laws and the constitution in places like Ukraine. It is none of our business. Politicians throughout history have tried to solve every problem conceivable to man, always failing to recognize that many of the problems we face result from previous so-called political solutions. Government cannot be the answer to every human ill. Continuing to view more government as the solution to problems will only make matters worse. I have never been one who is comfortable talking about my faith in the political arena. In fact, the pandering that typically occurs in the election season I find to be distasteful. But for those who have asked, I freely confess that Jesus Christ is my personal Savior, and that I seek His guidance in all that I do. The only thing we should prohibit is violence. Strictly speaking, it probably is not necessary for the federal government to tax anyone directly. It could simply print the money it needs. However, that would be too bold a stroke, for it would then be obvious to all what kind of counterfeiting operation the government is running. The present system combining taxation and inflation is akin to watering the milk, too much water and the people catch on. Liberty built civilization. It can rebuild civilization. There is no reason, in a free society, that farmers shouldn't be allowed to raise hemp. Hemp is a good product. It's not like I'm just trying to win and get elected. I'm trying to change the course of history. If you give up on your principles, I don't think that's being pragmatic. Doing the wrong thing, even partially, isn't being practical. If you have the right ideas and are forceful enough, I think you can get the support you need. Quantitative easing is just the latest chapter in the Federal Reserve's 100-year history of failure. The American people have suffered long enough under a monetary policy controlled by an unaccountable, secretive central bank. It is time to finally audit, and then end, the Fed. The freedom message brings us together, it doesn't divide us. In a free society, we are supposed to know the truth. In a society where truth becomes treason, however, we are in big trouble. Congress remains in total denial as our liberties are rapidly fading before our eyes. The process is propelled by unwarranted fear and ignorance as to the true meaning of liberty. It is driven by economic myths, fallacies, and irrational good intentions. Is it any more moral to dilute the value of the purchasing power of the money you hold in your wallet than it is for the farmer to dilute the milk supply with water? I'm all for raw milk. I think you should make your own choice on whether you drink raw milk or not. All branches of our government today are controlled by individuals who use their power to undermine liberty and enhance the welfare warfare state and frequently their own wealth and power. The federal government cannot maintain a budget surplus any more than an alcoholic can leave a fresh bottle of whiskey untouched in the cupboard. During World War II, Joseph Stalin was once asked by an American writer, according to Professor Dean Russell, how he could justify conscripting all the property of all the people for use by the government to fight the war. Stalin answered by asking why they considered it more immoral and illogical to conscript lifeless property than to conscript life itself, as was being done in the United States and all other capitalistic countries. His American challenger had no answer, because there was no answer. Every country ended slavery without civil war. U.S. could have. We don't need any troops abroad, they don't help our defense. Stop policing the world and we can get rid of income tax. Suicide terrorism stops when we stop intervening abroad. Astonishingly, American taxpayers now will be forced to finance a multi-billion-dollar jobs program in Iraq. Suddenly the war is about jobs. We export our manufacturing jobs to Asia, and now we plan to export our welfare jobs to Iraq, all at the expense of the poor and the middle class here at home. If economy were good, there'd be no immigration problem. September 11th does not justify ignoring the Constitution by creating broad new federal police powers. The rule of law is worthless if we ignore it whenever crises occur. The federal government has no authority to deliver a service and there's no evidence to show that government has ever been efficient at delivering service. Bush's humble foreign policy was hijacked into nation building. Close Department of Education, but don't dismantle public schools. They've been taught by too many that this war was necessary when it isn't. Our forefathers would think it's time for a revolution. This is why they revolted in the first place. They revolted against much more mild oppression. The cost in terms of liberties lost and the unnecessary exposure to terrorism are difficult to determine, but in time it will become apparent to all of us that foreign interventionism is of no benefit to American citizens, but is instead a threat to our liberties. America's heart and soul is more embedded in our love of liberty, self-reliance, and tolerance than by our foreign policy, driven by powerful special interests with little regard for the Constitution. I believe only a free society can ever be truly secure. The goal should be to make terrorists feel threatened, not the American people. Libertarianism is the enemy of all racism. I believe that when we overdo our military aggressiveness, it actually weakens our national defense. I mean, we stood up to the Soviets. They had 40,000 nuclear weapons. Now we're fretting day in and day and night about third world countries that have no army, navy, or air force. Once created, federal programs are nearly impossible to eliminate. Your money has never been safe in the government's hands, and it never will be. Governments spend money, it's just their nature. By encouraging Americans to adopt a group mentality, the advocates of so-called diversity actually perpetuate racism. Their obsession with racial group identity is inherently racist. Young people are not raw material to be employed by the political class on behalf of whatever fashionable political, military, or social cause catches its fancy. In a free society, their lives are not the playthings of government. No matter how many pro-freedom politicians we elect to office, the only way to guarantee constitutional government is through an educated and activist public devoted to the ideals of liberty. I see this piece of legislation as essentially being a declaration of virtual war. It is giving the president tremendous powers to pursue war efforts against a sovereign nation. I think it is another example of a flawed foreign policy that we have followed for a good many decades. Our country's founders cherished liberty, not democracy. Unfortunately, the greater the humanitarian outreach, the greater the violence required to achieve it. Big government flourishes under Republicans. Everybody complains about pork, but members of Congress keep spending because voters do not throw them out of office for doing so. The rotten system in Congress will change only when the American people change their beliefs about the proper role of government in our society. Too many members of Congress believe they can solve all economic problems, cure all social ills, and bring about worldwide peace and prosperity simply by creating new federal programs. We must reject unlimited government and reassert the constitutional rule of law if we hope to halt the spending orgy. Some members of Congress will claim that the federal government needs the power to monitor Americans in order to allow the government to operate more efficiently. I would remind my colleagues that, in a constitutional republic, the people are never asked to sacrifice their liberties to make the jobs of government officials easier. Everyone on the Commission assumes that 9/11 resulted from a lack of government action. No one in Washington has raised the question of whether our shortcomings, brought to light by 9/11, could have been a result of too much government. No matter what politicians promise, Social Security reform will not change the fact that your money is taken from your paycheck and sent to Washington, where it will be spent. This is the deadening consensus that crosses party lines, that dominates our major media, and that is strangling the liberty and prosperity that were once the birthright of Americans. Dissenters who tell their fellow citizens what is really going on are subject to smear campaigns that, like clockwork, are aimed at the political heretic. Truth is treason in the empire of lies. Too many members of Congress believe they can solve all economic problems, cure all social ills, and bring about worldwide peace and prosperity simply by creating new federal programs. Never voted to spend 1 penny of Social Security money. Only about 5% of blacks have sensible political opinions. If Iran invaded Israel, it's up to Congress to declare war. Israeli government: the neocons want U.S. to bomb Iran. With the exception of the military-industrial complex, we all want a more peaceful world. Both sides of the political spectrum must one day realize that limitless government intrusion in the economy, in our personal lives, and in the affairs of other nations cannot serve the best interests of America. One thing is certain: those who worked and voted for less government, the very foot soldiers in the conservative revolution, have been deceived. Today, the ideal of limited government has been abandoned by the GOP, and real conservatives find their views no longer matter. Political conventions lend themselves to pandering, as few politicians can resist the temptation to tell a national television audience how well they will run the country, if elected. The problem is that government is not supposed to run the country, we're supposed to be free. The world's smallest political quiz is responsible for many Americans' first contact with libertarian ideas. While traveling around the country, I have often heard people say, "I never knew I was a libertarian until I took the quiz." The only thing we learn from history, I am afraid, is that we do not learn from history. Prohibiting guns on campus made the Virginia Tech students less safe, not more. Because federal hate crime laws criminalize thoughts, they are incompatible with a free society. We need to take away the government's money power. The banking industry needs its welfare check ended. The dollar's soundness depends on its being untied from the machine that can make an infinite number of copies of dollars and reduce their value to zero. In the American political lexicon, change always means more of the same, more government, more looting of Americans, more inflation, more police state measures, more unnecessary war, and more centralization of power. Without precise meanings behind words, politicians and elites can obscure reality and condition people to reflexively associate certain words with positive or negative perceptions. In other words, unpleasant facts can be hidden behind purposely meaningless language. But whether the resistance against government tyrants is nonviolent or physically violent, the effort to overthrow state oppression qualifies as true patriotism. The government does not need to know more about what we are doing. We need to know more about what the government is doing. We should be thankful for individuals like Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald who see injustice being carried out by their own government and speak out, despite the risk. They have done a great service to the American people by exposing the truth about what our government is doing in secret. True prosperity can only come from a healthy economy and sound money. That can only be achieved in a free society. A failing state cannot stop a revolution whose time has come. Nothing good can come from the Federal Reserve. It is the biggest taxer of them all. Diluting the value of the dollar by increasing its supply is a vicious, sinister tax on the poor and middle class. Government spending is always a tax burden on the American people and is never equally or fairly distributed. The poor and low-middle income workers always suffer the most from the deceitful tax of inflation and borrowing. I hope every person who reads or hears this will take the time to go back and read the Declaration of Independence. Only by recapturing the spirit of independence can we ensure our government never resembles the one from which the American states declared their separation. The Boston bombing provided the opportunity for the government to turn what should have been a police investigation into a military-style occupation of an American city. This unprecedented move should frighten us as much or more than the attack itself. We must educate ourselves and others about our precious civil liberties to ensure that we never accept demands that we give up our Constitution so that the government can pretend to protect us. In wartime, people willing to sacrifice liberty for security. Everyone who believes in freedom must work diligently for sound money, fully redeemable. Nothing else is compatible with the humanitarian goals of peace and prosperity. The theory of the IRS is rather repugnant to me because the assumption is made that the government, owns 100% of your income and I permit you to keep 5%, 10%, or 20%. You're vulnerable, you've sold out. The government can take 80% if they want, which they did at one time. Under the Constitution, there was never meant to be a federal police force. Even an FBI limited only to investigations was not accepted until this century. Yet today, fueled by the federal government's misdirected war on drugs, radical environmentalism, and the aggressive behavior of the nanny state, we have witnessed the massive buildup of a virtual army of armed regulators prowling the states where they have no legal authority. The sacrifice of individual responsibility and the concept of local government by the majority of American citizens has permitted the army of bureaucrats to thrive. There's been a coup, have you heard? It's the CIA coup. The CIA runs everything, they run the military. They're the ones who are over there lobbing missiles and bombs on countries. And of course the CIA is every bit as secretive as the Federal Reserve. And yet think of the harm they have done since they were established, after World War II. They are a government unto themselves. They're in businesses, in drug businesses, they take out dictators. We need to take out the CIA. I have this terrible habit of wanting to try to be consistent and develop a philosophy that's coherent. I believe that Israel is one of our most important friends in the world. There's capital controls and there's people control. So every time you think of a fence keeping all those bad people out, think about those fences maybe being used against us, keeping us in. The Cap and Trade Bill H.R. 2454 was voted on last Friday. Proponents claim this bill will help the environment, but what it really does is put another nail in the economy's coffin. Washington bureaucrats have classified the very air we exhale as a pollutant and have gone unchallenged in this incredible assertion. The logical consequence is that there will come a time when we will have to buy a government permit just to emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from our own lungs. Spain has been massively diverting capital from the private sector into politically favored environmental projects for the better part of a decade. Every green job created eliminated 2.2 real jobs and cost around $800,000 each. Whether the 1993 World Trade Center bombing was a setup by the Israeli Mossad, as a Jewish friend of mine suspects, or was truly a retaliation by the Islamic fundamentalists, matters little. Government is the enemy of conservatism and freedom. You know, freedom is a very popular idea, and young people love it, and they're open to ideas. And they like principled answers to our problems. What else do we need to know about the political establishment than that it refuses to discuss the crimes that terrify Americans on grounds that doing so is racist? Why isn't that true of complex embezzling, which is 100% white and Asian? If it's not accepted that big government, fiat money, ignoring liberty, central economic planning, welfarism, and warfarism caused our crisis. We can expect a continuous and dangerous march toward corporatism and even fascism with even more loss of our liberties. I think it's a theory, the theory of evolution, and I don't accept it as a theory. Don't steal, the government hates competition. All rights are individual. We do not get our rights because we belong to a group. Whether it's homosexuals, women, minorities, it leads us astray. You don't get your rights belonging to your group. A group can't force themselves on anybody else. So there should be no affirmative action for any group. Ideas are the only things that count, and politicians are, for the most part, pretty much irrelevant. If you have ever been robbed by a black teenaged male, you know how unbelievably fleet-footed they can be. Jury verdicts, basketball games, and even music are enough to set off black rage, it seems. I wouldn't vote against getting rid of the Jim Crow laws. Immigrants can spread diseases for which we may have no immunity. There is also the question of crime and culture. Many immigrants come from countries with different legal structures and are not willing to behave in the way we expect American citizens to behave. There is no such thing as a hate crime. Critics of NAFTA and CAFTA warned at the time that the agreements were actually a move toward an eventual merging of North America into a border-free area. Proponents of these agreements dismissed this as preposterous and conspiratorial. Now we see that the criticisms appear to be justified. Who's married and who isn't married? I have my standards, but I shouldn't have to impose my standards on others. Other people have their standards and they have no right to impose their marriage standards on me. Opinion polls consistently show that only about 5% of blacks have sensible political opinions, i.e. support the free market, individual liberty and the end of welfare and affirmative action. The ultimate goal is not simply a superhighway, but an integrated North American Union complete with a currency, a cross-national bureaucracy, and virtually borderless travel within the Union. Like the European Union, a North American Union would represent another step toward the abolition of national sovereignty altogether. It's not part of our Constitution to assume that we are the world's policemen. You know, the greatest hoax I think that has been around in many, many years, if not hundreds of years, has been this hoax on the environment and global warming. You notice they don't call it global warming anymore. It's weather control. I take my marching orders from the Constitution. Order was only restored in LA when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks 3 days after rioting began. What if the checks had never arrived? No doubt the blacks would have fully privatized the welfare state through continued looting. But they were paid off and the violence subsided. What can you do? More and more Americans are carrying a gun in the car. An ex-cop I know advises that if you have to use a gun on a youth, you should leave the scene immediately, disposing of the wiped-off gun as soon as possible. Such a gun cannot, of course, be registered to you, but one bought privately, through the classifieds, for example. We get our rights from our Creator as individuals. So every individual should be treated the same way. Imagine if the political elites in our country were forced to endure the same conditions at the airport as business travelers, families, senior citizens, and the rest of us. Perhaps this problem could be quickly resolved if every cabinet secretary, every member of Congress, and every department head in the Obama administration were forced to submit to the same degrading screening process as the people who pay their salaries. There should essentially be no limits to the voluntary definition of marriage. From the Great Depression, to the stagflation of the 70s, to the current economic crisis caused by the housing bubble, every economic downturn suffered by this country over the past century can be traced to Federal Reserve policy. The Fed has followed a consistent policy of flooding the economy with easy money, leading to a misallocation of resources and an artificial boom, followed by a recession or depression when the Fed-created bubble bursts. Think of what happened after 9/11, the minute before there was any assessment. There was glee in the administration because now we can invade Iraq, and so the war drums beat. I'm convinced that you never have to give up liberties to be safe. I think you're less safe when you give up your liberties. Failure of government programs prompts more determined effort, while the loss of liberty is ignored or rationalized away, whether it is the war on poverty, drugs, terrorism, or the current Hitler of the day. An appeal to patriotism is used to convince the people that a little sacrifice of liberty, here or there, is a small price to pay. The results, though, are frightening and will soon become even more so. Mr. Speaker, I once again find myself compelled to vote against the annual budget resolution for a very simple reason. It makes government bigger. Let the revolution begin. And yet even among the friends of liberty, many people are deceived into believing that government can make them safe from all harm, provide fairly distributed economic security, and improve individual moral behavior. If the government is granted a monopoly on the use of force to achieve these goals, history shows that power is always abused. Every single time. You have to remember, rights don't come in groups. We shouldn't have gay rights. Rights come as individuals, and we wouldn't have this major debate going on. It would be behavior that would count, not what person belongs to what group. Today's events are reminiscent of the Old Testament story of how the Israelites demanded a king over God's objection. They believed that a king would give them peace and security. The results proved otherwise. If two parties with two sets of bad ideas cooperate, the result is not good policy, but policy that is extremely bad. What we really need are correct economic and political ideas, regardless of the party that pushes them. I would say that I'm pretty mainstream. Only in a free society do individuals have the best chance to seek virtue, strive for excellence, improve their economic well-being, and achieve personal happiness. The worthy goals of civilization can only be achieved by freedom-loving individuals. When government uses force, liberty is sacrificed and the goals are lost. It is freedom that is the source of all creative energy. Rights mean you have a right to your life. You have a right to your liberty, and you should have a right to keep the fruits of your labor. I, in a way, don't like to use those terms: gay rights, women's rights, minority rights, religious rights. There's only one type of right. It's the right to your liberty. When the goal of political action is no longer the defense of liberty, no word other than demagoguery can describe the despicable nature of politics. America was founded by men who understood that the threat of domestic tyranny is as great as any threat from abroad. If we want to be worthy of their legacy, we must resist the rush toward ever-increasing state control of our society. Otherwise, our own government will become a greater threat to our freedoms than any foreign terrorist. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any force. The Federal Reserve and Congress have systematically taught the American people to trust the government and that caution in spending is harmful to the economy. In a free society we're supposed to know the truth. In a society where truth becomes treason, then we're in big trouble. And now, people who are revealing the truth are getting into trouble for it. This is media, isn't it? I mean, why don't we prosecute the New York Times or anybody that releases this? The role of the federal government is to protect our liberties. That means they should protect our religious liberties to do what we want, our intellectual liberty, but it also should protect our right to do to our body what we want. You know, what we take into our bodies. You can at least let sick people have marijuana because it's helpful. But the compassionate conservatives say, well, we can't do this. We're going to put people who are sick and dying with cancer and are being helped with marijuana if they have multiple sclerosis. The federal government is going in there and overriding state laws and putting people like that in prison. What we need to do is not only live within our means, but start paying down the deficit, and offer an opportunity at least for the next generation to get out. The Fed has one power that is unique to it alone. It enables the creation of money out of thin air. Sometimes it makes vast new amounts. Sometimes it makes lesser amounts. The money takes a variety of forms and enters the system in various ways. And the Fed does this through techniques such as open market operations, changing reserve ratios, and manipulating interest rates. Operations that all result in money creation. Liberty has meaning only if we still believe in it when terrible things happen and a false government security blanket beckons. We are talking about an awesome power. It is the power to weave illusions that appear real as long as they last. That is the very core of the Fed's power. Of course, not everyone is instinctively against this illusion-weaving power, and many even welcome it. Tragically, the innocent who understand little about the complexity of the monetary system suffer the most, while those who are in the know reap great profit whether the market is going up or down. The problem is that democracy is not freedom. Democracy is simply majoritarianism, which is inherently incompatible with real freedom. Our founding fathers clearly understood this. As an OB doctor of 30 years, and having delivered 4,000 babies, I can assure you life begins at conception. I will veto any spending bill that contains funding for Planned Parenthood, facilities that perform abortion, and all government family planning schemes. The federal war on drugs is a total failure. The federal government's going in there and overriding state laws. Why don't we handle the drugs like we handle alcohol? I fear the drug war because it undermines our civil liberties. It magnifies our problems on the borders. We've spent over the last 40 years $1 trillion on this war and, believe me, the kids can still get the drugs. It just hasn't worked. Privacy is freedom. Leave us alone. So the timeline of when we consider a fetus human is arbitrary after conception. Scientifically, there's no debate over whether the fetus is alive and human. What's happening is, there's transfer of wealth from the poor and the middle class to the wealthy. This comes about because of the monetary system that we have. When you inflate a currency or destroy a currency, the middle class gets wiped out. So the people who get to use the money first, which is created by the Federal Reserve System, benefit. So the money gravitates to the banks and to Wall Street. That's why you have more billionaires than ever before. If you care about your personal liberty, you'll be cautious when you feel comfortable, blame all the illegal immigrants for everything. What you need to do is attack their benefits: no free education, no free subsidies, no citizenship, no birthright citizenship. It's amazing that people don't understand that the more the market is involved and the smaller the government, the lower the price, the better the distribution, and the higher the quality. It would help the poor people who need jobs. Minimum wage is a mandate. We're against mandates, so why should we have it? It would be very beneficial. I think the policy makers like the idea of being the boss. I mean, people who like to boss other people around like to go into politics so they can become the boss. There's not much you can do about the bias of the media other than try to counteract it by putting the truth out best you can, and the internet has been a great weapon for holding the media accountable. Times of tragedy and war naturally bring out strong emotions. Sometimes people are only too anxious to sacrifice their constitutional liberties during a crisis, hoping to gain some measure of security. Yet nothing would please terrorists more than if we willingly gave up our cherished liberties because of their actions. It would be virtually impossible to finance wars without taxing the people, and the welfare system would be limited because there wouldn't be enough money in the bank to sustain it as it is, and that would help prices stay under control. I grew up in Pittsburgh, where you couldn't even see the noon sun in the sky, and that whole city was cleaned up without the federal government needing to be involved. I think we would have been much better served from the start if people would have better understood the principles of private property. I missed the closet. Homosexuals, not to speak of the rest of society, were far better off when social pressure forced them to hide their activities. When it comes to the environment and global warming from emissions, it has to be dealt with in one of two ways: preemptive regulations, which I don't agree with, or with private property principles. Nobody has the right to pollute their neighbor's air or water or land. The Congress should not be creating money out of thin air, which is what Lincoln did when he created greenbacks. But it is a congressional responsibility to maintain gold and silver as a legal tender. Al-Awlaki was born here, he is an American citizen. He was never tried or charged for any crimes. No one knows if he killed anybody. We know he might have been associated with the underwear bomber. But if the American people accept this blindly and casually, that we now have an accepted practice of the president assassinating people who he thinks are bad guys, I think it's sad. Demanding domestic security in times of war invites carelessness in preserving civil liberties and the right of privacy. Frequently the people are only too anxious for their freedoms to be sacrificed on the altar of authoritarianism thought to be necessary to remain safe and secure. A citizen walking through the airport today is bombarded with 1984-style propaganda messages that are designed to make us fear some amorphous threat and also be suspicious of others. The government designs these messages to make us feel dependent and heavily lorded over in every aspect of our lives. These messages are becoming ever more pervasive, hitting us even in grocery stores when we are shopping. But let it not be said that we did nothing. Let not those who love the power of the welfare-warfare state label the dissenters of authoritarianism as unpatriotic or uncaring. Patriotism is more closely linked to dissent than it is to conformity and a blind desire for safety and security. Understanding the magnificent rewards of a free society makes us unbashful in its promotion. Fully realizing that maximum wealth is created and the greatest chance for peace comes from a society respectful of individual liberty. If we are not even free anymore to decide something as basic as what we wish to eat or drink, how much freedom do we really have left? It's a mistake to think that poor people get the benefit from the welfare system. It's a total fraud. Most welfare go to the rich of this country, the military-industrial complex, the bankers, the foreign dictators. It's totally out of control. This idea that the government has services or goods that they can pass on is a complete farce. Governments have nothing. They can't create anything, they never have. All they can do is steal from one group and give it to another at the destruction of the principles of freedom, and we ought to challenge that concept. Terror is a tactic. We cannot wage war against a tactic. We should respect each other as rational beings by trying to achieve our goals through reason and persuasion rather than threats and coercion. I have a personal belief that you never have to give up liberty for security. You can still provide security without sacrificing our Bill of Rights. Ideas are very important to the shaping of society. In fact, they are more powerful than bombings or armies or guns. And this is because ideas are capable of spreading without limit. They are behind all the choices we make. They can transform the world in a way that governments and armies cannot. Fighting for liberty with ideas makes more sense to me than fighting with guns or politics or political power. With ideas, we can make real change that lasts. It is a dangerous notion that we need a government to protect us from ourselves. Liberty is lost through complacency and a subservient mindset. When we accept or even welcome automobile checkpoints, random searches, mandatory identification cards, and paramilitary police in our streets, we have lost a vital part of our American heritage. America was born of protest, revolution, and mistrust of government. Subservient societies neither maintain nor deserve freedom for long. Under the United States Constitution, the federal government has no authority to hold states accountable for their education performance. In the free society envisioned by the founders, schools are held accountable to parents, not federal bureaucrats. We have depended on government for so much for so long that we as people have become less vigilant of our liberties. As long as the government provides largesse for the majority, the special interest lobbyists will succeed in continuing the redistribution of welfare programs that occupies most of Congress's legislative time. We need to understand the more government spends, the more freedom is lost. Instead of simply debating spending levels, we ought to be debating whether the departments, agencies, and programs funded by the budget should exist at all. Unlike Newt Gingrich and Rick Santorum, I never voted to provide taxpayer funding to Planned Parenthood. Racism is simply an ugly form of collectivism, the mindset that views humans strictly as members of groups rather than individuals. We don't think a child of 13 should be held responsible as a man of 23. That's true for most people, but black males age 13 who have been raised on the streets and who have joined criminal gangs are as big, strong, tough, scary and culpable as any adult and should be treated as such. 1913 wasn't a very good year. 1913 gave us the income tax, the 16th Amendment and the IRS. America was born of protest, revolution, and mistrust of government. Subservient societies neither maintain nor deserve freedom for long. The most basic principle to being a free American is the notion that we as individuals are responsible for our own lives and decisions. We do not have the right to rob our neighbors to make up for our mistakes, neither does our neighbor have any right to tell us how to live, so long as we aren't infringing on their rights. Freedom to make bad decisions is inherent in the freedom to make good ones. If we are only free to make good decisions, we are not really free. When we finally decide that drug prohibition has been no more successful than alcohol prohibition, the drug dealers will disappear. The ultimate solution is not in the hands of the government. The solution falls on each and every individual, with guidance from family, friends, and community. The number one responsibility for each of us is to change ourselves with hope that others will follow. This is of greater importance than working on changing the government, that is secondary to promoting a virtuous society. If we can achieve this, then the government will change. I lean toward a flat tax. But I want to make it real flat, like zero. We must remember, elections are short-term efforts. Revolutions are long-term projects. The ultimate goal of the anti-religious elites is to transform America into a completely secular nation, a nation that is legally and culturally biased against Christianity. When one person can initiate war, by its definition, a republic no longer exists. Prices are going up. Unemployment is continue to go up. And we have not had the necessary correction for the financial bubble created by our Federal Reserve System. I think Israel should be treated as an independent nation and not a puppet of our state. I never would force the Justice Department to go to California and arrest people getting medical marijuana, when that's the law there. We have to restore confidence that the marketplace can deliver services as well as it can goods. People should not be able to vote to take away the rights of others. We're being taxed to blow up bridges in Iraq and rebuild them, while ours at home are falling down. In the free society envisioned by the founders, schools are held accountable to parents, not federal bureaucrats. The most sinister of all taxes is the inflation tax, and it is the most regressive. It hits the poor and the middle class. When you destroy a currency by creating money out of thin air to pay the bills, the value of the dollar goes down, and people get hit with a higher cost of living. It's the middle class that's being wiped out. It is most evil of all taxes. We have a lot of goodness in this country. And we should promote it, but never through the barrel of a gun. We should do it by setting good standards, motivating people, and have them want to emulate us. But you can't enforce our goodness, like the neocons preach, with an armed force. It doesn't work. General welfare is a general condition. Maybe sound currency is general welfare, maybe markets, maybe judicial system, maybe a national defense, but this is specific welfare. This justifies the whole welfare state, the military-industrial complex, the welfare to foreigners. The welfare state that imprisons our people and impoverishes our people and gives us our recession. The President and other government officials denounce school violence, yet still advocate for endless undeclared wars abroad and easy abortion at home. U.S. drone strikes kill thousands, but nobody in America holds vigils or devotes much news coverage to those victims, many of which are children, albeit of a different color. After years spent in Washington, I have become more aware than ever of the government's ineptness and the likelihood of its making mistakes. I no longer trust the U.S. government to invoke and carry out a death sentence under any conditions. May future generations look back on our work and say that these were men and women who, in a moment of great crisis, stood up to their politicians, the opinion makers, and the establishment, and saved their country. Sexually transmitted diseases is caused by sexual activity and promiscuity. It spreads diseases. That's been known, about 400 or 500 years, that somehow these diseases are spread. If fault comes with people because of their personal behavior, but it isn't to be placed on a burden on other people, innocent people, why should they have to pay for the consequences? Do they think if we destroy our freedoms for the terrorists they will no longer have a reason to attack us? I would absolutely never use the federal government to enforce the law of using marijuana. If you can't protect life, then how can you protect liberty? Outsourcing is a reflection of a bad economic environment domestically. If you fix that, you fix outsourcing. Our primary export is paper money, and that should change if you change the monetary policy. Given the inefficiencies of what D.C. laughingly calls the criminal justice system, I think we can safely assume that 95% of the black males in that city are semi-criminal or entirely criminal. Governments have nothing. They can't create anything, they never have. All they can do is steal from one group and give it to another at the destruction of the principles of freedom, and we ought to challenge that concept. Each of us should choose which course of action we must take: education, conventional political action, or even peaceful civil disobedience to bring about necessary changes. But let it not be said that we did nothing. We need a smaller and elite military, as Donald Rumsfeld said, and also a smaller and elite foreign policy. I do not have much confidence in the political system and never did. My goal has always been to change people's minds because as long as people demand more government, they will get it. The number one responsibility for each of us is to change ourselves with hope that others will follow. The sad thing is, our foreign policy will change eventually, as Rome's did, when all budgetary and monetary tricks to fund it are exhausted. What we need is a strong defense, but right now there is zero chance of an invasion by another country, and right now we have more firepower than all other countries put together. Expect the rapidly expanding homeschool movement to play a significant role in the revolutionary reforms needed to rebuild a free society with constitutional protections. The greatest threat facing America today is the disastrous fiscal policies of our own government, marked by shameless deficit spending and Federal Reserve currency devaluation. It is this 1-2 punch, Congress spending more than it can tax or borrow, and the Fed printing money to make up the difference, that threatens to impoverish us by further destroying the value of our dollars. We can achieve much more in peace than we can ever achieve in these needless, unconstitutional, undeclared wars. Contrary to the claims of the supporters of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the sponsors of H.Res. 676, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not improve race relations or enhance freedom. Instead, the forced integration dictated by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 increased racial tensions while diminishing individual liberty. We should have a strong president, strong enough to resist the temptation of taking power that a president shouldn't have. First reason is, it's not authorized in the Constitution, it's an illegal institution. The second reason, it's an immoral institution, because we have delivered to a secretive body the privilege of creating money out of thin air. If you or I did it, we'd be called counterfeiters, so why have we legalized counterfeiting? But the economic reasons are overwhelming. The Federal Reserve is the creature that destroys value. Amend Constitution to remove aliens' birthright citizenship. My message is simple. Freedom works a lot better than the authoritarian style of government. I'm not sure what Al Gore did for peace. I don't think he have been high on my list for the Nobel Peace Prize. When people become frightened, they look for things of real value. They will go to monetary metals, gold and silver, and they will buy other things, such as buying property. But no matter what we have, whether we have our gold coins or we have our property, if we have an authoritarian government, that is our greatest threat. So, I would like to think that there is no perfect protection, other than shrinking the size and scope and power of government, so that we can be left alone and take care of ourselves. Why is patriotism thought to be blind loyalty to the government and the politicians who run it, rather than loyalty to the principles of liberty and support for the people? Real patriotism is a willingness to challenge the government when it's wrong. Sanctions are not diplomacy. They are a precursor to war and an embarrassment to a country that pays lip service to free trade. If global warming is because of weather changes, which a lot of people believe, there's not much we can do to change the weather pattern. We in the Congress have a moral and constitutional obligation to protect the value of the dollar and to understand why it is so important to the economy that a central bank Not be given the unbelievable power of inflating a currency at will and pretending that it knows how to fine-tune an economy through this counterfeit system of money. Unskilled and inexperienced workers are the ones most often deprived of employment opportunities by increases in the minimum wage. Once you get the government involved in agriculture, you'll have nothing but problems and expenses. Banning guns because of their misuse is like banning the First Amendment because one might libel or slander. It is true that liberty is not free, nor is it easy. But tyranny, even varying degrees of it, is much more difficult, and much more expensive. The time has come to rein in the federal government, put it on a crash diet, and let the people keep their money and their liberty. When we give government the power to make medical decisions for us, we, in essence, accept that the state owns our bodies. If people won't spend any money, the government has this moral obligation to do it. If you ever can bring about revolutionary changes, two things would be required: young people would have to be involved and you would need music. By the way, when I say cut taxes, I don't mean fiddle with the code. I mean abolish the income tax and the IRS, and replace them with nothing. Right now, nobody legalized paper money. Where did that come from? The original American patriots were those individuals brave enough to resist with force the oppressive power of King George. Patriotism is more closely linked to dissent than it is to conformity and a blind desire for safety and security. Could America exist without an income tax? The idea seems radical, yet in truth America did just fine without a federal income tax for the first 126 years of her history. My understanding is that espionage means giving secret or classified information to the enemy. Since Snowden shared information with the American people, his indictment for espionage could reveal, or confirm, that the U.S. government views you and me as the enemy. Freedom is not defined by safety. Freedom is defined by the ability of citizens to live without government interference. Government cannot create a world without risks, nor would we really wish to live in such a fictional place. Only a totalitarian society would even claim absolute safety as a worthy ideal, because it would require total state control over its citizens' lives. Liberty has meaning only if we still believe in it when terrible things happen and a false government security blanket beckons. I have come to one firm conviction after these many years of trying to figure out the plain truth of things. The best chance for achieving peace and prosperity, for the maximum number of people worldwide, is to pursue the cause of liberty. If you find this to be a worthwhile message, spread it throughout the land. Let it not be said that no one cared, that no one objected once it's realized that our liberties and wealth are in jeopardy. Why is it that some people, think we should obey the Constitution sometimes and not other times? Governments, whether they're dictatorships or democracies, reflect the people. When the people get fed up, they throw them out. Our Constitution, which was intended to limit government power and abuse, has failed. The founders warned that a free society depends on a virtuous and moral people. The current crisis reflects that their concerns were justified. The federal government overrules state laws where state laws permit medicinal marijuana for people dying of cancer. The federal government goes in and arrests these people, put them in prison with mandatory, sometimes life sentences. This war on drugs is totally out of control. If you want to regulate cigarettes and alcohol and drugs, it should be at the state level. The catch-all phrase "the war on terrorism," in all honesty, has no more meaning than if one wants to wage a war against criminal gangsterism. Terrorism is a tactic. You can't have a war against a tactic. It's deliberately vague and non-definable in order to justify and permit perpetual war anywhere and under any circumstance. I'm not against the FBI investigation in doing a proper role, but I'm against the FBI spying on people like Martin Luther King. I'm against the CIA fighting secret wars and overthrowing government. I wish I could say I was shocked at the reports the NSA is secretly spying on the private phone calls of millions of Verizon customers. However, this is a predictable result of a government that continues to erode our liberties while promising some glimmering hope of security. It is no coincidence that the century of total war coincided with the century of central banking. Republican control of the Senate equals expanded neocon wars in Syria and Iraq. Boots on the ground are coming. When you have war, whether it's a war against drugs, war against terrorism, war overseas, the mentality of the people change and they're more willing to sacrifice their liberties in order to be safe and secure. Why does the U.S. care which flag will be hoisted on a small piece of land thousands of miles away? The constant refrain that bringing our troops home would demonstrate a lack of support for them must be one of the most amazing distortions ever foisted on the American public. We don't have the freedom of speech to talk about the weather. We have the First Amendment so we can say some very controversial things. The American people are sick and tired of Washington, and the people who have been in charge have been passing all these bills, and I've been voting no all of the time and vote no on these appropriation bills. Freedom is living without government coercion. So when a politician talks about freedom for this group or that, ask yourself whether he is advocating more government action or less. Speak up, speak often, and don't worry about those that at this point cannot understand, as they can never unhear what we tell them. I want to just obey the Constitution. The Constitution says only gold and silver can be legal tender. There's a right to privacy for all individuals and all who have legal rights, and that includes the unborn. As an obstetrician, if I cause any harm to a fetus, I will be sued. If someone kills or harms a fetus, they're liable in a court of law. As long as we live beyond our means, we are destined to live beneath our means. We need to make sure that people can save all the money they spend on medical care by getting it back from their taxes, by reducing their tax burden. If you drink too much, you go out and you harm to somebody, you have to suffer the consequences. Same way with health matters. You don't have the right to demand that someone else take care of you because of your habits. What if the American people woke up and understood that the official reasons for going to war are almost always based on lies and promoted by war propaganda in order to serve special interests? There is but one special interest that we should be working for, and that would solve just about all of our problems, and that is our liberty. You can't have a healthy economy without sound money, which is why we're on the verge of a very serious economic problem. If people are smokers, don't they have to pay more? Sometimes, you get your insurance cheaper if you are a non-smoker. So, let the market sort this out and insurance sort it out, but not having dictates by the government saying you must do this and your behavior doesn't matter, you know. The true patriot is motivated by a sense of responsibility and out of self-interest for himself, his family, and the future of his country to resist government abuse of power. He rejects the notion that patriotism means obedience to the state. I would say nobody is perfect. I don't know all the answers. Don't want to run people's lives and run the world and run the economy. So, my qualifications are a little bit different. If you sacrifice liberty for security, you will lose both. I am convinced that there are more threats to American liberty within the 10-mile radius of my office on Capitol Hill than there are on the rest of the globe. We need to get the government out of the way. Inflation hits the middle class and the poor the most. Those are the people who are losing it. We don't have enough competition. There's a doctor monopoly out there. We need alternative health care freely available to the people. They ought to be able to make their own choices and not controlled by the FDA preventing them to use some of the medications. Article 1 Section 8 of the Constitution says Congress has the ability to coin money and regulate the currency and doesn't say anything about gold or silver. Truth is treason in the empire of lies. One thing is clear, the Founding Fathers never intended a nation where citizens would pay nearly half of everything they earn to the government. Get rid of IRS, get rid of income tax, get rid of spending. I'm always looking for an opportunity to bring progressive Democrats together with some conservative libertarian types, because there are places where we can agree. If we stuck to the Constitution as written, we would have no federal meddling in our schools, no Federal Reserve, no U.S. membership in the UN, no gun control, and no foreign aid. We would have no welfare for big corporations, or the poor, no American troops in 100 foreign countries, no NAFTA, GATT, or Fast Track, no arrogant federal judges usurping states' rights, no attacks on private property, no income tax. We could get rid of most of the agencies, and most of the budget. The government would be small, frugal, and limited. Foreign aid is taking money from the poor people of a rich country and giving it to the rich people of a poor country. No single person, including the President of the United States, should ever be given the power to make a medical decision for potentially millions of Americans. Freedom over one's physical person is the most basic freedom of all, and people in a free society should be sovereign over their own bodies. When we give government the power to make medical decisions for us, we in essence accept that the state owns our bodies.